Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 31. Anything like the sound of a rat makes my heart go pit-a-pat. Robert Browning, the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Oh, mother, mother, there has been an old man in the dairy, the dreadful Norma's big rat mother, and he's stolen a pat of butter and the rolling pin. Beatrix Potter, the roly-poly pudding. Contrary to her mother's belief, Betsy Oliver was not in bed when the Misses Ardley and Potter called to borrow Kep. She was in fact sitting at the top of the narrow stairs in her pink flannel nightdress, her elbows on her knees and her fist jammed under her chin, listening to what was being said in the kitchen. When Miss Potter remarked that she and Miss Ardley intended to go ratting, Betsy scowled horribly for a moment or two, then stood up and squared her shoulders. If they could take Kep ratting, although she couldn't fathom why they fancied Kep, the dog was a tracker, not a ratter, and a lazy layabout where work was concerned, she could take Mr. Brown on the same errand. And when the hunting was all done and over, they could compare their catches, although not where Mother could hear it. And she could gloat, and gloat she would to be sure, for the owl was a superb hunter who much preferred rats to mice, and larger rats to smaller, could be counted on to best that lazy Kep any night of the week. Her father had once read her a poem called The Pied Piper. When he had come to the lines where the sound of the rat made his heart go pit-a-pat, she laughed out loud. She and father had agreed that it was exactly how Mr. Brown must feel when he made to dig his talons into a cowering rat. The spirit of the game dispelled any sleepiness, and she ran lightly to her tiny corner room under the low thatched roof, skinned out her nightdress, and pulled on a pair of breeches and a dark blue shirt. She tucked her hair up under a black woolen cap and climbed out the window. Her descent down the drain-pipe was executed with the careless panache of long practice. When she reached the ground, she darted towards the shed, keeping to the shadows, and slipped through the door. As she did so, she heard the voices of Miss Ardley and Miss Potter, who were leaving by the front way. "Who?" Mr. Brown inquired querulously from his perch by the window. Jemima Puddledog, nesting for the evening in a box of straw, pulled her head out from under her wing and uttered a drowsy quack. "And where have you been?" Betsy demanded, hands on her hips. Jemima had gone missing that afternoon. Betsy had searched everywhere for her to no avail. Jemima put her head on her wing again. Of course, she wouldn't tell where she had been, for she was still trying to find a place to lay her eggs undisturbed and raise a family. Probably she had found one, and she intended to keep it secret. "Pay no attention to Jemima," Betsy told Mr. Brown. "She is obsessed with ducklings." She slipped her hand into the leather gauntlet sleeve her father had contrived for her. "We're going ratting." Mr. Brown's golden eyes glittered, and he clicked his sharp beak in anticipation of dinner. She found an old gunny bag, then released the owl from his perch. With the bird on her arm, she stole through a hole in the garden hedge, went around the brick wall of the back corner, and set out through the fog. 15 minutes later, under a misty moon that turned the drifting fog phosphorescent and set the trees to glimmering as if they had been dipped in mercury, Betsy and Mr. Brown crossed the pasture and fetched up at the stone wall above the barn at Highfields Farm, where she knew the hunting to be better than anywhere else in the neighborhood. When the owl returned with his prey, she planned to drop his kill into the gunny bag. Allowing Mr. Brown an interim snack or two would only delay him and dull his appetite. If their catch of the night were to exceed that of Kep and his two borrowers, the owl's desire for dinner would need to remain sharp. The night was chilly, but for the next while Betsy kept warm by busying herself with the owl. In fact, the two of them were enjoying quite the most remarkable success, a success at least partly attributable to the fog that was draped like a diasporous shawl over the trees and fields, softening even the ominous sound of the owl's wing beat. Indeed, it might have been the fog that explained what happened next, for to Betsy's great surprise, while she was sitting on the wall waiting for Mr. Brown to return from his third sortie, his first two quite dead victims were safely in the bag, she glimpsed the shadowy forms of a dog and two shawled women. one of them carrying a lantern that cast huge, wavering shadows against the barn wall. They crept furtively along the side of the barn, opened the door and went inside and shut it behind them. The moon moved behind a cloud. Betsy stifled a surprised exclamation. She should have thought that Miss Artley, who had evidenced quite a little interest in the barn, would think to go hunting there, and coming along the lane would be considerably delayed. Her surprise also held not a little envy. Why hadn't she thought to take Mr. Brown into the barn, where he might hunt in a warmer, drier place? A seat in the hay would have been far more comfortable than a perch on the fence, where the cold of the stones penetrated through her breeches, and the silvery dark was distinctly chilly. And there were far more rats in the barn than in the hedgerows outside. She drew down her brows and gritted her teeth. Her opponents had displayed a devious ingenuity with which she had not credited them. Mr. Brown came back crestfallen and empty-clawed from his third flight, but Betsy praised and stroked him anyway, and released him with a special word of encouragement. As if to show her his gratitude, he returned with a brown mole of not unsubstantial size, with enormous whiskers and a very long tail. Betsy congratulated him on his skill and cunning, and popped the mole into the bag with the rats, and released the owl once again, confident that she and Mr. Brown would outshine the ratters in the barn. They were unlikely to find a mole in there. And it was in that mood, with the celebration of victory in her heart, that the second surprise of the evening overtook Betsy. It was a scratchy burlap sack that smelled horribly of fish dropped over her head. She bit and spit and cried and wriggled, but despite her efforts to escape, she was flung to the ground, held down by an invisible knee and several hands, and rolled up in the sack as neatly as if she were the raisin and currant and sugar and butter filling in the roly-poly puddings her mother made with a rolling pin. Her ankles trussed, her arms pinned to the side, her nose and mouth filled with the stink of rotten fish, and her heart pounding in terror. The rats had put Betsy in their bag.